Welcome to The Evolution of Torah, a History of Rabbinic Literature, a JTS podcast introducing you to the first 1,000 years of rabbinic literature with Rabbi Mordechai Schwartz. This is Episode 1, Who Were the Rabbis?
A wise person once said, "The past is a foreign country. They do things differently there." And I think this is the central question of history. Are we more like people in the past than we know, or are we essentially different from them? The first thing I want to start with is a distinction between the religion we practice today, which we call Judaism, and the religion that the rabbis, the classical rabbis of about 1800 years ago, practiced. Their religion, which I would call Torah and mitzvot, rather than calling it Judaism, was somewhat different from our own. A lot of the practices were the same, but I think that the goals were quite different. The goal of their religion really wasn't to find personal meaning. Ours is. Ours is to create a sense of community, or maybe to make a commitment to the Jewish people, create Jewish identity, or maybe even to make the world a better place. And all of these things were important to those classical rabbis, but they were really side benefits. The main goal of rabbinic religion from the time of the destruction of the temple in the year 70 CE until the Crusades about 1,000 years later was to please God and demonstrate love and fear of God by following the commandments and embodying Torah. This goal allowed for a lot of broadness, a great variety of practices, and a diversity of beliefs, but all of those different rabbis, I think, shared that main goal. There were different ways that the rabbis were in the world. They oftentimes had ideals, and they tried to live up to those ideals, but just like all human beings, there were times that they failed. So I'm going to try and show you, using 3 stories, what the rabbinic ideals were, and also what the rabbinic reality was. I want to be clear that I'm not telling this story as something that historically happened, may have happened in some version, but that's not the primary reason I'm using these stories. These stories illustrate what I think are rabbinic values. So these 3 stories appear in the Talmud. Some of you might be familiar with at least one of them. I think I'm going to start here. I'm going to tell the stories in order, and I'm going to start with the rabbinic ideal of authority, and the authority that rests in their knowledge of both the written Torah and a second Torah that they believed existed, which was an accompanying oral tradition, which they called the oral Torah. So there was an incident involving a non-Jew who came to see Shammai. The Gentile said to him, "How many Torahs do you have?" And Shammai replied, "We have 2. We have an oral Torah and we have a written Torah. The oral Torah explains the written Torah." The non-Jew replied, "Listen, I can believe in the written Torah, but not the oral Torah. I want to convert, but I only want to convert on the condition that you just teach me the written Torah." So Shammai shouted at him and he threw him out of the building. From there, he went to see Hillel, who converted him immediately. He began teaching him the Torah, meaning just the written Torah. And he said, first you have to learn the alphabet. So on that first day, he taught him Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Daled, and so on. And the next day, he reversed the order of the letters, and he told him that an Aleph was a Tav, and so on and so forth. And the convert said to him, "But yesterday, you didn't say that." So Hillel said to him, "You see, it's impossible to learn what is written without relying on an oral tradition," meaning relying on me to tell you what the real names of these letters actually are. So you have to accept my authority. You have to accept what I'm telling you in order to be able to properly learn what Torah is and how it works. As I said, this first story is about the authority that the rabbis have. It's pretty clear that Shammai is actually a foil here, that even though Shammai might represent the way that some rabbis actually are in reality at the time, that they are insular and separate from the larger community, they want to be more like Hillel. They want to be open to the world and accepting, but they also want to maintain their authority. And that authority comes from their special knowledge of the accompanying oral tradition. A wise person once said that religion begins in mystery, but it ends in politics. And politics is how we bind ourselves together into groups, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. One of the ways that we establish an affinity for each other is by having a shared belief. And in this particular case, we saw that it was the oral Torah. And the next story, we're going to see that a shared trauma can bind us together into a group and actually make for a new beginning. The second story goes like this. There was another incident involving a non-Jew who came to see Shammai, and he said to him, "Convert me on the condition that you teach me the entire Torah while I'm standing on one foot." This is the story that some of you might find familiar. Shammai chased him away with the builder's cubit, which is something like a yardstick, some kind of measuring device for construction, that he was holding in his hand. This same non-Jew came to see Hillel, and Hillel once again converted him right away and said, "That which is hateful to you, don't do to another." That's the entire Torah. The rest is commentary. Go and study. So this, as I said, is the most famous of these three stories. It's actually the middle story. It's not even the last of these three stories, which would be sort of the punchline of the stories. And we often tell this story to talk about, the golden rule. It's what we use often in Hebrew schools to teach the idea that we shouldn't treat others in a way which is negative or bad. I think there is something even more radical going on here. I think that the idea here is actually that the way that we show our love for God is through the way that we treat other people. Like I said before, the goal of the rabbis was always to show love for God, fear for God. But in fact, here, what we see is the way that that can be accomplished is through the way that we treat people. When we hurt other people, we hurt God. This story could also be about violence. And violence was something that the rabbis universally hated. The symbol of the builder's cubit could be about a kind of violent pedagogy, the ruler that is waiting to come down or to push the student out. Hillel instead is accepting. He wants to have an encounter with the student where he actually is able to reject that kind of pedagogy and to reject the idea of violence as a whole. Another thing that could be going on here in the builder's cubit is that it could be a symbol. It's an implement of building, an implement of creation of a physical space. And we have to remember that this is a group of people who feel the loss of a physical space, the loss of the temple, quite deeply. They also feel it in the loss of priestly holiness, which is something that we'll talk about in the next story. So here's the third and final story in the cycle. This story also involves a non-Jew who comes to Shammai to convert. This time, the non-Jew comes to Shammai and says, "Convert me on the condition that I become the high priest." Shammai doesn't tell him that, in fact, there's a hereditary priesthood, that, in fact, you cannot become the high priest unless you come from a particular priestly family. So he casts the non-Jew out of his study hall once again, and once again the non-Jew goes to Hillel. And Hillel says to him, "I'll convert you, but first you have to learn, before you become the high priest, what are the rules about the high priest." So he goes and he starts studying Torah, and he discovers that, in fact, the priesthood is hereditary, that only the descendants of Aaron can become the high priest. And at that point, you might expect that he would become disappointed, that he would walk away. But in fact, Hillel had faith that the process of Torah study would bring him in. And this seems to be what actually happens at the end of the story, because he ends up praising Hillel for accepting him immediately. We can see from the conclusion of this story that it seems as though the convert no longer cares about becoming the high priest, and that this new perspective, this new way of understanding what's important in the world has come through the process of Torah study. And I think that's one of the things that's going on here, that in fact Torah study has replaced sacrifice and the hereditary priesthood. And it's specifically Torah study under the supervision of Hillel, who represents, as we've said, the ideal rabbi. So I think this story actually is about the temple and about the hereditary priesthood. One of the things that's actually going on here is that the rabbis are relating to the priesthood and the importance of the priesthood and the temple. It was the central institution of Jewish life. It was the way that Jews related to God, even if they were living far away from it. They sent their taxes every single year. They would actually send off to have sacrifices made on their behalf. And when the temple was destroyed, it created a vacuum. The Romans, when they destroyed the temple, thought that they were destroying Judaism. And in some ways, they were right. The Judaism that came after was very, very different than the Judaism that existed when the temple was standing. And one of the things that the rabbis had to do was find a way to fill the vacuum that the absence of the temple created. And I always use the analogy of a prosthetic limb, that in fact, one of the things that happens when a person has a loss of part of their body, which this is equivalent to, is they have to come up with something new, a new way of acting in the world, a new way of understanding how their body works. The rabbis created that. And even if they didn't intend for it to happen, they supplanted the temple. They replaced the priesthood. They became those who stood in the place where the priests, the Kohanim, once stood. And the way that they gained their authority was through learning. So now I want to go back and just remind us, what are the ideals that we see the rabbis putting forward? What are they projecting? These were the rabbis. They were people who believed in an accompanying oral Torah that actually determined the meaning of the written Torah, and they thought that all of that was God's manifest will in the world, that represented their authority. They also were people who hated violence and rejected violent resistance in favor of a more gentle spiritual resistance. And they were people who displaced the temple and the hereditary priesthood, whether they intended it or not. And there's also a fourth element here, which is even though they have a tendency, and they recognize that tendency, to be separate and isolated and sequestered, they have a desire to actually be inclusive and to reach out and to be part of the world. So this is now the question. How did this small group we call the rabbis begin to remake Judaism? It is through Torah study and through texts. And we'll see that next time when we explore the oldest text from the rabbis that we have, the Mishnah.
Thanks for listening to The Evolution of Torah, A History of Rabbinic Literature from JTS with Professor Mordechai Schwartz. It was recorded here at JTS by Larry Camiola and produced by Rabbi Tim Bernard. If you enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe and review us on Apple Podcasts. You can find all of JTS's podcasts at www.jtsa.edu/podcasts, and you can send us an email at onlinelearning@jtsa.edu. Please support JTS podcasts and other community learning programs by visiting jtsa.edu/podcastgiving to donate.